Good morning, everyone. Today we're starting this new podcast about freezing embryos in embryo freezers. Today we're here with Dr. Bill Croushore. I'm gonna allow Dr. Bill to introduce himself. But today I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about this topic that to us matter a lot for the ones that like freeze a lot of embryos, for the ones that have to deal with many embryo freezers and the freezing process out there. It's a challenge. It's difficult sometimes. We do have the ability to make those embryos frozen for a long period of time, and to learn a little bit more about it, we will be speaking with Dr. Crozier today. Bill, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Ramon. I want to thank the ATA promotion committee for starting this whole podcast thing. It's pretty neat idea and allows ATA to kind of be viewed by members and non-members alike, kind of at their convenience. So, um, my name is Dr. Bill Croushore. I'm a veterinarian in southwestern Pennsylvania. I do almost exclusive embryo transfer work. I'm involved in a food animal practice and have a partner and an associate um, named White Oak Veterinary Clinic in Somerset, Pennsylvania. Um, I started doing embryo transfer work probably about 15, 16 years ago and kind of fell in love with it. The more I did, the more I wanted to do. And we were fortunate to hire an associate a couple of years ago and allowed me to concentrate on full-time embryo transfer. I do primarily OPU for IVF, but we do still do some conventional collections. I'm certified with ATA since I think 2012, 2013, whenever the meeting was in Winnipeg. I think that might have been 2012. Um, and we do most of our conventional collections now are for export, mostly to Japan. We do also do some beef collections. We hardly ever collect a dairy animal for conventionally collect a dairy animal unless it's for export. So that's kind of my story.
Oh, that's great. Great story. And Bill is well respected, certified veterinarian with the AETA. We all look up to him, and we understand that like he has done a lot for this association. We thank you, Bill, for being part of the team and for leading us to become better embryo transfer practitioners out there. So, with that in mind, I will just go ahead with our questions. It's mainly to talk about what do we all see on our daily basis, our practice goes. What are the main type of embryo freezers out there, Bill? And do you see um, different ones? Which ones do you have? Tell us a little bit about what you actually do when you're freezing your embryos.
So we currently use a freeze control unit. That's our primary embryo freezer. We have a chrysalis freezer that I've been unable to get calibrated. So we keep it as a backup. And I have a third backup that's it's probably an antique. I bought it in 2008, I think, and it was a used uh, piece of equipment. Then it's called a North neck freezer. It was and it's kind of a really neat unit for those of you who don't have never seen one. If you've never used one, it's developed by a practitioner named Bud North. Bud has since passed away a few years ago, but it's pretty ingenious. It's a cylinder. Ramon, are you familiar with the North freezer?
No, I have never used that one.
So
Is
it's
it
just
like a manual or is
yeah,
it's
it's
just
just it's a cylinder of aluminum with a stem coming out of the top that's narrow enough to fit down inside the neck of a nitrogen tank. And there's holes drilled in to the cylinder, uh, parallel with the length of the cylinder to be able to place the straws. And
That's
then
all.
there are other holes drilled in the stem that allow you to put. We just used a transfer gun to suspend the neck, or to suspend that cylinder within the neck of a nitrogen tank, and it kind of sticks halfway out. And the principle is the cold from the liquid nitrogen causes the temperature of the cylinder, of the aluminum cylinder, to drop. And what Bud found out was that aluminum cylinder suspended in a neck of a nitrogen tank, the temperature drops at a fairly linear rate. And depending on one, the level of nitrogen in the tank, and two, the the height at which you suspend that piece of that cylinder within the neck, you can drop it at zero point 0.3, 0.5, 0.9, 1.5 degrees centigrade a minute. And we use a thermocouple to measure the rate. And then once you figure out where that level is for the cylinders to suspend in the tank, then you can that linear rate of temperature drop doesn't change from time to time as long as your nitrogen level remains pretty close to where it was. It's so it that was the first freezer I used when I started doing collections 15 or so years ago. And it really made you pay attention to the physiology of freezing and the freeze curve, because I mean we literally would sit there while embryos were freezing, recording the temperature of the cylinder through the thermocouple every 60 seconds so that we could be sure that the temperature was dropping at a constant rate, at a linear rate. Um, and you also had to completely understand the freeze curve and where the seed temperature is and where the hold temperature is. And then you had to know how to drop it. And then once you get to your desired temperature, where to plunge. That is a freezer that we still have that we would only use if we had to. For instance, if we didn't have power, and our backup battery in the freeze control freezer was dead, we would use it. If for some reason we would have to use a client tank um, to actually do the freeze for whatever reason, if we didn't have nitrogen with us, which would be unusual. But fortunately, we haven't had to use it since we got the
That's
uh,
awesome.
yeah, but it's a nice, it's kind of a nice backup to have. The freeze control unit that we use now is it's used. I think it was probably manufactured 2010. I bought it used. We had it serviced, had it have to send it back to Australia to get calibrated, but we have every confidence in it. It's got the uninterruptible power backup in case the power does go out. It does run off a battery. And then the chrysalis freezer we have is a backup to that.
Oh,
There
that's
are
good.
other freezers out there that I haven't used before. I'm not really too familiar with their name, but I know there's some methanol freezers out there that some of them are electric, some of them, and there's another one that runs off of that actually cools through the liquid nitrogen in a tank. Ramon, do you remember the name of that freezer?
It's a ET3300. It's forgive me if the name is not there, so it's basically numbers, but I do use that one. I don't ever remember the name of that one, but it's basically like a rod that is put inside of a nitrogen tank, and then you fill the chamber with methanol, or you can even use, like, 95% pure, like, alcohol from the liquor store. You can always get those. And then we I've always used, back in the day when I worked for Sexton Technologies, the BioCool. Not sure if a brand name is allowed to be said in a podcast, but we use that one because BioCool has a little motor that will make the methanol circulate. I
Okay.
think that makes the methanol more homogeneous, and with the temperature being more stable, as per my wife is an embryologist, so as per our conversations and the way we have discussions about, it seems like methanol has a better interaction with like keeping the temperature like more kind of a constant like around the embryo, and then freezing it in a better pattern. I have never compared myself the difference between nitrogen versus methanol, like you're talking about. But many practitioners that I know that do more in vitro work, they do prefer to use the methanol. But Bill, so do you agree that mainly like the two types of besides the one that you just mentioned that was the kind of the manual, I would say, labor process that you use on the very first one you use. Do you agree that like we have two types of freezers, which is methanol and nitrogen based ones?
Yeah. I think the methanol ones are electric, right? I mean, they use some
Correct.
sort of a refrigerant to cool it, and then the nitrogen based ones just use the cold of the liquid nitrogen to drop the temperature.
Yes. So that's the difference between like the biocool system. I don't completely understand their freezer, but you're right. It's an electric system that will make it's what I the way I see Bill is like mainly about like how we freeze brand cows, right? So it makes that temperature comes down to the point of freezing. But there's also like an electric system to the biocool that will make the temperature drop down. On the one that I use, the one with the raw, the E something 3300, the that one, you're right. The rod will be inserted in a liquid nitrogen tank, and the tank will suck up the nitrogen from the rod and make the methanol temperature go down. And it's also controlled by an electric system. We can always have the ability. There are two connections on that one, and then we use the fact that we can control the temperature and then just hit the button. The only difference with that, and you corrected me if I'm wrong, is that like some freezers they do have you have to count like for how many times you have to wait like those 10 first minutes, and some will be automatic. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it just depends on how those are programmed. I'm pretty sure the freeze control you can get a program that they can program that machine to have the 10-minute or whatever holding period after seeding. The program that I use on my machine does not have that. We just hold it at -6 until the 10 minutes after seeding, and then we begin the temperature drop. The Chrysalis that I used, the program that I was using, it had the 10-minute after seeding built in. So, once you seed, you press the run button and walk away. But with the freeze control, the program that I use, you have to wait the 10 minutes, which forces you to check the seed to make sure that the seed was effective, that you didn't lose it. Which is a good thing, I think, to make sure, because you sure don't want that temperature drop to occur until the seed is complete.
Bill, with that, I'm going to jump into the next question. What's the embryo freezing process? How is that like from beginning to end? Could you explain to our audience? Like some of our young practitioners, they don't know or they don't freeze embryos. And then, as I understand nowadays, more of the new ET practitioners that want to take the certification exam, they do need to know how's the process freezing embryos. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I I don't know. This stuff is published somewhere. I don't know where it is. But the cryo physiology it's kind of fascinating to me. The process starts with placing the embryos in whatever freeze media that you're using. We use the 1.5 molar ethylene glycol, the direct transfer media. Most practitioners today, that's what they're using. There's very few embryos that are ever frozen in glycerol anymore. But the
You,
process,
sorry, just one question there. Are you using ethylene glycol with sucrose or without sucrose?
we use it with sucrose, but um, according to John Hassler, there's not really any difference in embryo survival with or without sucrose. But we do freeze the occasional IVF embryo, and it's nice to be able to see that blast cavity collapse a little bit. I don't think I'm not aware of any work that was done with zero point 0.1 molar sucrose in ethylene glycol for IVF compared to conventional embryos. I think most of that work was done with conventional embryos, comparing the difference between with or without sucrose. But we use sucrose just kind of out of habit. But the process begins with the equilibration of the embryos. So we collect the embryos, we decide which ones we're going to freeze, and then place those embryos in the ethylene glycol media. And then you need about 5 to 10 minutes at room temperature for those embryos to equilibrate, which means that ethylene glycol has to penetrate the cells of the embryo. Ethylene glycol is a fairly small molecule and penetrates the cells of the embryos easily, readily. After 5 or 10 minutes of the equilibration, we expect that the concentration of ethylene glycol within that embryo is high enough that we can start the freeze process. It has to occur at room temperature. If it's too cold, we don't think they're going to equilibrate enough. If it happens too warm, I don't think there's anything published on this, but I suspect that you're going to increase the metabolism of the ethylene glycol within those cells, and the toxic byproducts of ethylene glycol metabolism can be toxic to the cell. So we're always careful to equilibrate at room temperature. We usually equilibrate for 8 minutes. That's just our SOP. If you did 5, if you did 10, I don't think it would matter, but 8 minutes is kind of what we've decided on. After the equilibration process is over, we have our freezer ready at -6 degrees Celsius, and we place the straws in the freezer. And then we allow that temperature of the media in the straws that contain the embryo to achieve the same temperature of the freezer, which is -6. That takes about 2 minutes. That's our SOP. 2 minutes from the time we put the straws in the freezer until the time we seed. Seeding is where we introduce ice into the straw, and we do that by I use a cotton tip swab. Some people will use a hemostat submerged in the liquid nitrogen. We will dip the straw into the liquid or not the straw, the swab into the liquid nitrogen until it quits boiling, and then we pull a straw up out of the freezer and touch the swab to the top of the straw to initiate ice formation. We do not touch the column that contains the embryo. We only touch the column at the very top and allow that ice formation to occur. And we do that on all straws at the same time. So if we're freezing embryos from 3 different donors, we've got all the straws in the freezer at the same time, and we initiate seeding all at the same time. That's our SOP. Some people will seed at 2 minutes and then go process the next donor and then put those in the freezer and seed. But our SOP is to seed the entire batch of embryos in the freezer at the same time. Once the seed happens, the seed, it's kind of magic to me. What you're doing is you're initiating ice crystal formation within the straw. you're not freezing the embryo yet. As that seed starts to travel down the straw, you're making more and more ice within the straw. So remember, when you put that unfrozen straw in the freezer, that media within that straw is super cooled. So it is below the freezing temperature, but it is not frozen yet. It's super cooled. And when you initiate ice formation, that ice is going to travel down that super cooled straw until it reaches the bottom. And ice crystals are pure ice, they're pure water. And the solute level within the liquid portion of that straw starts to increase in concentration. So you're creating a hypertonic situation for that embryo. The embryo is not frozen; it's kind of suspended in a slushy. There is ice around it, but the embryo itself is not frozen. So as that ice crystal formation occurs all the way down to the bottom of the straw, that embryo is suspended in this like kind of frozen slushy, and it's starting to become hypertonic to the embryo and it's starting to dehydrate the embryo. And that's the whole point of freezing, is we're trying to dehydrate the embryo so that ice crystals do not form within the cells. We seed, we allow that seed to travel for 10 minutes. 10 minutes is our SOP on the seed. So I set my timer for 10 minutes. Once the timer beeps, I check my straws to make sure the seed is complete. And then we start the descent of the temperature descent of the freezer. Have I left anything out so far, Ramon?
Yeah. No, you're good.
Okay, so once we have achieved seeding and the ice crystal has gone all the way down to the bottom, we'll start the descent. And the descent that we use is -6 degrees centigrade per minute. And our freezer has it automatically does that. It drops the temperature. The way I look at it, it looks like it's about 0.2 degrees centigrade every 20 seconds. And then it will drop the temperature. And as the temperature drops at 0.6 degrees centigrade a minute, more and more ice, which is pure frozen water, will form, taking more water out of the solution, creating an even more hypertonic condition for that embryo, who is still suspended in an ice slushy, to dehydrate that embryo further. And the studies that were done years ago found that the rate at which the embryo likes the best is about 0.5 to 0.7 degrees centigrade a minute. We shoot for the middle of that, which is 0.6. Drop the temperature at 0.6 centigrade a minute until that temperature of the straw reaches -32. And that is just our SOP. You can go -30, -35, we think is the sweet spot for plunging. But once we've hit -32, then we can go ahead and plunge. That embryo should be sufficiently dehydrated at that point. We think it's somewhere around 70% dehydrated. If you dehydrate them too much, it's detrimental to the embryo. If you don't dehydrate them enough, then you get large ice crystal formation within the cells that destroys the organelles, it destroys the embryo. So we think once the temperature reaches somewhere around 32, -32 centigrade, somewhere between -30 and -35, it's safe to plunge. And then the plunge process is simply taking the embryo out of the freezer, which is at -32 degrees centigrade, and then plunging them directly into liquid nitrogen. We plunge them into the cane that is full of liquid nitrogen that's in our nitrogen bath. That's how we plunge, so that we don't have to pull them out of nitrogen again and put them into a cane. So that we plunge them right into the cane, and then you put your top goblet in and put them in your storage tank. So
That's
once that hits -30 to -35, and the embryo is sufficiently dehydrated, that's when you actually freeze the embryo. The embryo is not frozen until you plunge. And then the dehydration that has occurred protects the embryo from the large ice crystal formation within the cells.
that's a great class that we just were giving here, guys. And I just want to let you know, for the ones that are like, listening to us, it's really rare for you to find whole explanation out there, like this one from Dr. Croushore on is the whole process from start to beginning on the freezing process. That's great that you were able to explain with us, Bill, with such a detail. And that's all on ethylene glycol. If I'm not wrong, we just touched base a little bit, but we didn't go uh, a lot in depth. But so can you do the same thing with like ethylene glycol and then glycerol as well, or is there a difference between the two medias on freezing the embryo? I'm not speaking about thawing the embryo, but the freezing the embryo.
Our freeze process for glycerol, 10% glycerol is the same. It is the same process for freezing ethylene glycol. We use the same seed temperature. We use the same equilibration. We use the same temperatures. We do everything the same.
Great, great. And now that you explained to us how the whole process works, um, have you ever had an issue while in the middle of freezing the embryos and then like you explained early, you ran out of power or your battery went bad or did something happen to you where you had to troubleshoot right there with your embryo freezer? What to do? I mean, for someone that it's out there getting started, do you recommend something if your something happens with your freezer right in the middle of like freezing the embryos?
Yeah. Unfortunately, like anybody who's done enough embryo transfer work eventually runs into a train wreck with freezing. I'll tell this story. It's a tough story to tell. I hate reliving it, but I was freezing some embryos for a client of mine who was a really good client. Actually helped me kind of get started in embryo transfer. A number of years ago, we were still using the neck freezer, the Bud North freezer. We were using our thermocouple as a means to monitor the temperature. So what our process was to suspend the North freezer in the neck of the tank, put the thermocouple in, watch the temperature until it got to, I think it was -1 centigrade. Then we would change position. We would actually raise the freezer up a little bit, the cylinder up, so that it would slow the rate of decline, and then it would get to about -6, and it would hold there. And we knew where that point was. It was pretty consistent. We used the thermocouple to confirm that, and when we got to -6, then we just held it there. I equilibrated the embryos for 8 minutes. Checked the thermocouple, it read -6. I thought, boy, that thing's really nice and steady at -6, so we put all the straws in. And then we waited our usual couple 3 minutes before we seed. And when I pulled the first straw up, it had self-seeded. And I thought, well, that's peculiar. That doesn't happen very often. When I pulled the second straw up to seed it was seeded too. And I thought, oh crap. And I pulled the rest of them up and they were all seeded. And I looked at my thermocouple and it read -6. And I said, what in the world is going on? And I looked at my backup thermometer, which I failed to check in the beginning, and it read -13,
Oh
which
no.
basically flash froze those embryos. And it was out of his favorite cow. And we had about 10 grade 1 embryos that we were freezing that we had just killed. And so I had to explain to my client that we had just destroyed 10 of the grade 1 embryos that we had just got out of his favorite cow, and asked him how he wanted us to make it right. And we made it right. And he was not happy. I was not happy, but we made it right. So what do you do in that situation when they flash freeze? Well, when those embryos flash freeze like that, there really ain't anything you can do about it. They basically cooked. They weren't dehydrated enough. Those embryos were frozen as opposed to floating in a slushy. Those embryos actually froze during that process. And what we did to confirm that is we thawed them. We took them out, thawed them at room temperature, dumped them out, looked them under the microscope, and there was all the cellular degeneration that we could see. The embryos just degenerated. There was there was no saving them, and we just tossed them. So it's very important to have, if you're using a North Freezer, to have a backup thermocouple or backup thermometer in case your thermocouple malfunctioned. That's what happened. Our thermocouple malfunctioned. To this day, I don't know why it did. But those embryos were cooked. If if you get in a situation where you are freezing and you seed successfully and your freezer malfunctions after seeding, um, I think the point of no return is about minus 20 Celsius. And this is just kind of what I've heard over the years. There's nothing published on this. This is so a little bit of speculation from people that have actually talked to Stan Lebo, who did most of this early work. I know some people that knew Stan Lebo before he passed away. Stan Lebo was a scientist at the Oak Ridge. It was a facility in Tennessee. It was I almost think it had something to do with nuclear power, but Stan somehow had an interest in cryopreservation and did a lot of this work early on. But um, people that have talked to Stan Lebo say minus 20 is kind of the point of no return, where something goes wrong before minus 20. If you're warmer than that, then you slowly thaw the embryos and you start over. And if it happens after minus 20, then you just bite the bullet and plunge. And some of those embryos are going to be sufficiently dehydrated and others aren't. Then your pregnancy rate if you're plunging at, say at minus 22 or minus 25, you may make some pregnancies, but your pregnancy rate isn't going to be what it is if you had taken them to your normal seed temperature. And if it malfunctions under minus 20 and the embryos aren't flash froze, then what I've always told myself what would have happened in that situation was just to slowly warm the embryos back to minus 6, yeah, you could probably go to minus 6, or you could thaw them and reseed them, and then start the process over again. I don't know what the rationale is for that. Maybe, minus 20 is where they think you may start to have enough dehydration where a plunge could not kill all the embryos. I don't know. Unfortunately, Stan passed away a number of years ago, and he's probably the only one in the world who understood this. And we'll never get the opportunity to ask him on this side of the world. But we think that minus 20 is kind of the drop dead spot.
Yeah, we early on when I was practicing in Wisconsin, Dr. Steve Moline have done like tons of like conventional work, and he basically spoke with me many times about how do you troubleshoot a freezer, and exactly the explanation you gave me was exactly the explanation he gave me back then. He mentioned to me, he's like, "Well, if you're halfway through it and for some reason you run out of power and there is a problem, just plunge the embryos into nitrogen. Or if you're like closer to the temperatures there, if you're like at least like uh, three quarters, a quarter of the process in, and something happens, what you need to do, you need to go back and start over." That's how he taught me. He was, one of my mentors. And this process, I believe the in vivo embryos are tough enough where like they could survive a situation like this. You hit a great spot there. How to approach your client about this is the most important topic, because sometimes we are not going to always be perfect on our line of work. We deal with a lot of variables, and explain to the client exactly what happened, that your thermocup like failed on you. We always have equipment failure. There is no way to prevent that other than like, service your equipment regularly, even though you're not like able to control if equipment will just fail or if power will go out. What do you do in a situation like this? Is the most important like process to go over with your client. And you're 100% right, Bill. The the best thing to do is to just go there and be transparent with your client and understand that like the conceptual rates won't be the same. And even despite what cow it is, right? And we don't want those things to happen, but they do happen. And that's why we're having this podcast. We wanted to troubleshoot and see where can we do better? What can we improve? And is there any methods for us to focus or to do a correction to the process? If we Bill, another question. If we happen to, from the get-go, we have fresh embryos, we just collected them, and our freezer goes bad before even we start. And I'm just going to throw this scenario out there for you. How long do I have until I can call a practitioner near me or a friend that has a freezer that can help me with bringing their freezer over? The embryos are fresh or right there. Is that a couple of hours? How do you see that?
So the our time that we want to start the freezing process from collection is 4 hours. And for every hour that those embryos are out and not frozen, you lose a little bit of pregnancy rate. And then 4 hours is just our time. So if we have multiple donors to collect and we know we're going to be freezing, we will collect what we think we can get in the freezer within 4 hours and then go collect more donors. If you have a problem and you're at 4.5 hours and you don't have a freezer, I wouldn't give up on them. It's sort of a linear rate of decline in embryo survival, beginning at collection and going through 4 hours, and however long those embryos will survive in holding media, which is probably a long time. But 4 hours is our goal. I had a situation here several years ago where a neighboring practitioner had collected a donor, and I had actually lent them one of my freezers that malfunctioned when they were preparing to freeze the embryos. So it would not hold at -6. The cryo chamber was not warming. It would blow right past -6, and there was nothing they could do to get it to stop. And they brought the embryos to me. I think they collected the cow that afternoon. It was dark by the time we got them, and it was not wintertime. So I think it was probably about 8 or 9 o'clock at night before we got them. So it was 8 or 10 hours after collection that we actually got these into a different freezer. The embryos still looked good, and I never did follow up with them to inquire about pregnancy rates on that collection, but I suspect that they were not what they would have been if they would have been frozen within 3 or 4 hours of collection. But I would not give up on them. I would still try and find another practitioner with a functional freezer to get them frozen yet if recipients just weren't available. But I guess the short answer to your question is 4 hours is our goal. And if you have to, drive 4 more hours to get a freezer, you have to drive 4 more hours to get a freezer. You want to get them frozen.
Yes, yes. No, that's great for you to answer that question because we might be susceptible to like have an issue where like our freezer just did not start or the chamber is not holding the -6 temperature. We don't have power. Not having power, I think, is a not as bad issue if you haven't started the process because you can just find a generator or a battery and then you can start from there. But mainly the goal is to get the embers frozen, as you said, in the 4 hour period. Um, Bill, to finish our podcast here, I'm just gonna ask you about freezing in vitro embryos and versus in vivo, and then see what your thoughts on it. Who have you done it, and what are the the big differences between freezing in vivo versus in vitro?
So we have frozen some. We have frozen some from several different labs. Um, we don't freeze them. As a rule, I prefer to let the embryos at the lab, for the lab to freeze them the next day. I know it's sort of a profit center to be able to freeze embryos, but I don't think that taking them out of their controlled environment, putting them in an incubator, putting them in UPS's custody, letting them bounce around all over the United States in planes and trucks and everything is necessarily good for the embryos. So we only freeze them if we run out of recipients, for whatever reason. If we underestimate the quality of the recipients and we have more embryos than to transfer fresh than what we have recipients for, then we will freeze them. And our process for freezing is it's similar to in vivo embryos, but it's not identical. And the only real difference that we do is we allow the embryos to equilibrate at um, room temperature for 20 minutes as opposed to 8 minutes. Because it has most of these hopefully are great stage 7 grade ones, and they have a very large blastocele cavity. And I suspect it just takes longer for that ethylene glycol to equilibrate into them. There are some labs who use that as part of their SOP for freezing, and we just copied that. So we do equilibrate for 20 minutes in ethylene glycol. We do use sucrose, and you can observe that blastocele cavity collapsing some. We're usually loading them into straws as soon as we can, allowing the equilibration to continue in the straw, so we don't really see the full effect of the blast cavity collapse, but they do collapse. And we've made pregnancies. I probably wouldn't want to compare my frozen embryos preg rates to the ones that are frozen at the lab. I suspect I would be disappointed. But it's nothing really from our protocol. I don't think it's nothing of our technique of the freezing. It's just the conditions under which those embryos were cultured for the 24 hours prior to me getting them to freeze them. I think they're always going to be happier in a more controlled environment than what they will be, bouncing around the country in UPS planes and trucks and everything else.
Yeah, and then the rate that you go is also 0.6 degrees per
Yeah,
minute.
it's identical. Yeah.
Identical. Great. I do know that, like, and I think Dr. Demetrio, she has talked about that too. Like you said, exposing the embryo to sucrose until it collapses. That's a great pointer out there. Some other practitioners that I have discussed the same subject, they do prefer zero point 0.3 degree per minute. They want it to be frozen slower a little bit. And also, I mean, we're not going to get into this today, but there's also the process of vitrification, right? Where embryos are frozen in a more rapid manner. But the process is totally different, but we'll need another podcast to talk about that. Um, Go
One
ahead,
thing
Joe.
that would be a nice project for somebody would be to compare pregnancy rates with sucrose, whether they use 1 molar sucrose, um, having a minute of exposure to 1 molar sucrose, and then going through the freeze process to collapse the blastocele cavity versus just freezing them without the 1 molar sucrose. And I think Dr. Barfield at Colorado State has done some work on there, but I'm not sure how many of those embryos were actually transferred. But it would be a neat project if somebody would actually compare pregnancy rates between those two conditions of cryopreservation, the 1 molar sucrose and without.
Yeah, and then just to add to to your comment about the in vitro embryos, Bill, what speaking with some people that do mostly in vitro freezing, and then like also with my wife that does most of the work in vitro, work with a lot of in vitro embryos before, they do comment about it's anecdotal, but like some practitioners they will comment, and embryologists they will comment about the difference between uh, the methanol and the nitrogen freezers, preferring the methanol freezers for in vitro embryos versus the nitrogen freezers, uh, thinking that the same thing you said, you have a bigger blastocell, you have like more dehydration to do to the embryo, and then the embryo itself is has a different structure to the embryo versus an in vivo embryo, which the way I say it, so the public can understand, is that the in vivo embryos are a stronger embryo versus the in vitro, um, where it's sometimes harder to freeze those in vitro embryos in a very consistent way. The same, speaking of comparing them to in vivo embryos, because the in vivos are like more reliable compared to the in vitros. But there's a lot of research nowadays that shows that they can be about the same. There are some research that shows that the in vivo embryos are still like easier to freeze. I think also depends on the, like you spoke, like the stage, that stage and grade. I believe sometimes with more degenerate cells you have a harder time getting better conception rates. So but if you do have like the same grades, the stages will vary between a 4, freezing a 4, and then freezing a 7, which is the comparison that I'm making here is basically like it's practitioners that do freeze a lot of in vitros, they have said that like methanol freezers, they do a better job for them. And I don't know if you ever heard or anything like that.
I've not, but the temperature descent is um, linear, where it bounces with the electronic freezers. So I watch my freeze control unit; it'll drop at point 0.2 every 20 seconds, and it drops. I mean, it's a step down. It's a step down drop. And with the methanol freezers, and that was one of the things I liked about the old North freezer that suspends in the neck of a nitrogen tank, is that drop is linear. It doesn't bounce around. It drops at a constant rate, and it's not bouncing. And that freeze curve actually flattens out a little bit the closer you get to minus 32. And for us, and we would freeze these in methanol. We would fill the chambers of the cylinder that held the straws with methanol before we would put the straws in. And so they were bathed in methanol. It created a kind of a equilibrium between the immediate area surrounding the embryo and the actual cylinder itself. But that freeze curve would start to flatten out as you reached minus 20, minus 22. It would drop from 0.6 to 0.5 to 0.4. And then for us, whenever we would see it dropping at 0.3, then we would just drop the cylinder down into the tank by about a half a centimeter. And then the rate would start to come back up again closer to minus 0.6. I don't know that we had to do that. I just knew that the research showed that minus 6 was the rate that we wanted to be at. And maybe it would have been fine to let it slow down as you approach minus 32. I don't know. That would be maybe another project for somebody to do, to see what the hatch rates on those embryos would do compared to the a step down freeze.
Now talking about like we talk about freezers here, that's great. So the one thing that I find fascinating is the fact that there are so many things that we need to research about this. And the neat thing about it is that like our profession has so many ways to grow and then to show uh other practitioners can maybe jump into this and just show us that there are other methods out there, and there are better ways of doing embryo freezing, and we just haven't seen everything yet. It's really fascinating, in my opinion, that we haven't got to the bottom of like, hey, how do we better freeze embryos? We do use what we use. We've been using that for years, but is there any other revolutionary method out there that we haven't even thought about that could be used for us to freeze embryos? But
Yeah, I think
feel
the last major innovation happened about 30 years ago with the advent of direct transfer. I know the last seal collapse was kind of interesting when they started talking about it, what, 10, 12 years ago, maybe longer than that. But there really wasn't a ton of work. There wasn't really a ton of follow-up work done that I'm aware of with that. But there's, I'm sure that we don't know what we don't know. I'm sure there's opportunity to improve the process of freezing. I don't think that work would be too difficult to do. It sure wouldn't be very expensive to do. It would be maybe a little bit of time consuming. Just looking at hatch rates on different groups of frozen embryos, I think would be able to give us a lot of information. Uh, I know John Gibbons is doing some work down there in Texas on that. And I applaud him for doing that. And I suspect that Dr. Barfield's group is still doing some work with that too. But there's lots of opportunity for practitioner to be able to, if not do the actual research, to provide input in what work needs to be done. And I'm a curious person by nature, and I got lots of questions. I don't have lots of answers, but I got lots of questions. Um, and
that's good.
there's lots more that we could learn from this. And if anybody has ideas, take it to the research committee. They can hook you up with a group that can probably help do some of this research. And I'd encourage practitioners that if they're able to do this type of research in the field, do it. We've done a little bit of it in our practice. That it's very rewarding. It's very time consuming. It doesn't pay anything, but it's very rewarding. And I'd encourage anybody that has a good idea to get in touch with the research committee because that work could be done.
And I just want to tell people that the ones that they are starting this process right now of like becoming an ATA certified veterinarian, the this podcast is a great opportunity for you to learn, because Dr. Croushore here, he just told us like exactly what you need. Of course, you're gonna have to study that more in depth. There are other details you're gonna be, having to explain on your exam, but this was just like a very good class that you guys were taught right now. And to mention to the people that are getting into small ruminant that like the freezing process between the species are about the same. The only difference that like we do use glycerol more on small ruminants versus bovine, since we're having to thaw the embryo anyways to transfer. Uh, and that's just like one curiosity that I brought up to you guys here in order for us to find out. Well, with that, I would like to ask Dr. Croushore, just to give us a final message to the AETA practitioners and to our audience, to what just something that you learned a couple of years of being a practitioner, and final message for us just to stay with.
Well, I'm very grateful to the ATA for all the work that the association has done on behalf of the practitioner, on to help educate the practitioner, to help us all become better practitioners. I'm grateful to have been given the opportunity to serve on the board and the executive committee. Um, During the last few years, I went off the board last year, year before that maybe, but I'm grateful for that opportunity. It was a great experience for me, and I would encourage anybody to get involved with the ATA. The you will get more out of it than you will put into it. I can promise you that. The networking, the education that you get, just getting to know the people that you serve with on a committee, or if you're interested in being on the board, start with a committee for sure and learn how the association works. But there's opportunity to serve, and it's very rewarding, and you will get more out of it than what you put in.
With that message, I will end our podcast here today. Dr. Croushore, it's fascinating to learn from you what the whole process of freezing embryos in vivo and in vitro were about. Also, great tips on how to troubleshoot your freezer. There are many other brands probably out there that we are unaware of in other machines, but the core, the main directions on what to do was just taught here on this podcast. I like to also make sure that I tell everybody our conference is going to be in Canada from the 17th to the 19th in Toronto. Hope to see everyone out there. It's going to be a great conference, great topics, a lot of practitioners. We're going to be like discussing many things with our friends in Canada and understanding that like this whole network of people that come together once a year just to talk about embryo transfer, it's much bigger than ourselves. And then we, like Dr. Crouch just said, you get so much information out of it. The amount of like experience that is exchanged at the conference is just great. Well, guys, hope to see you soon. Once again, thank you, Dr. Croucher, and
Thank you,
see you
Ramon.
in Toronto. See you there.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.